Hello and welcome to yet another YouTube lecture. This is lecture number 8. We're still in period 4. This will be our final period 4 YouTube lecture. This one deals with abolition and suffrage. I do have a little tickle in my throat, so if you hear me cough a little bit, I apologize, but I have a little water here. That's so good. And I'll try to get through this with us all listening in. So let's start right in our key concepts. 4.1, Roman numeral 2, letter D. Now notice, always remember when it comes to the key concepts that a lot of our multiple choice questions can derive right from them. Right? We see this thought here that enslaved blacks and free African Americans created communities and strategies to protect their dignity and family structure, and they also, notice, joined political efforts aimed at changing their status. Always focus on those key concepts and make sure you kind of understand them so that some of the multiple choice questions that come your way, and I'll help you answer them. Obviously, it'll help you answer them. I'm not speaking correct English here all of a sudden. I'm trying not to cough here. I'm going to take another sip. And this is going to get annoying pretty quickly for you at home, I can tell. All right, let's look at this really fancy word over here. Here's our content. Remember, this is our concepts. Here's our content. The word enfranchisement. This word means the legal right to vote. To enfranchise somebody is helping them become a citizen and have the privileges of a citizen, which include that legal right of suffrage or that right to vote. We are going to have a situation by the 1830s. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of free black men and women living in both the North and the South, by the way. They're free. They can own property. They can have jobs. They can interact in communities, but they are not enfranchised. They will not be allowed to have U.S. citizenship, which, as you can tell, this is obviously anti-democracy. And this is where a lot of this abolitionist movement is going to come from. Not only the idea of abolishing slavery as an evil, which it is, but look at how it's totally against the concept of democracy. Even when blacks win their right to freedom, they're still denied enfranchisement, the idea of being a citizen and the right to vote. Now, why is that? Well, in the South, it's a fear of property rights, right? The Southerners view slavery as property. And if you attack slavery, well, you might attack all my property. And Southerners don't want that. So that's one of their fears, which is, hopefully you can see this is a stupid argument, but it's what they're basing everything on. But it's just as stupid for Northerners. In the North, it's industry. So you have major factories throughout all these northern cities. They're starting to employ thousands of individuals. But white people who are getting these factory jobs, these wage earners, they're now afraid of the competition that we're having with free blacks for these jobs. If you give them the right to vote, if you enfranchise them and make them citizens, it might be even harder to get a job. Well, that's nonsense, but that's what's happening. So that's why I put this here, very important to note. Not only does the abolitionist movement work to free slaves, but it also helped to expose the extent of prejudice in America. How much people were just prejudiced towards the black race, and how ridiculous this is. Obviously, abolition is banned in the South. Now, a couple of very powerful leaders of this movement, both of which are black. Of course, Frederick Douglass, a most deserving applause for him. One of the more famous of these individuals of the time period. Himself was born in slavery. Interestingly to note, his master's wife secretively helped him learn how to read and write because it was against the law in the South. By this time, it's now against the law to teach your slaves how to read and write. His master's wife will sneak down there at night and help him learn how to read and write, and she may have even have had a hand in helping him escape. Eventually, as he comes to the North and gets educated, he joins this abolitionist movement and eventually becomes the voice of free black America. We'll talk a lot about him over the ensuing weeks, especially his relationship with Abraham Lincoln, a very interesting one. They didn't start off liking each other very much, but at the end, a type of friendship will grow. Frederick Douglass is the first black man ever invited to the White House. Not only does Abraham Lincoln invite him once, but he invites him twice, which is very significant in this time period. We're going to look at the meaning of the fourth for the Negro. That's his famous speech, 1852. It's a very powerful speech because it points out the hypocrisy of the July 4th celebration. Here you're celebrating independence, right? You're celebrating your independence while 2 million or more individuals are in bondage in the country. And think about it like this too. You're in Washington, D.C. for a July 4th celebration. You could probably already imagine that, right, there's going to be fireworks are going to be displayed. That is a common practice, right, for 4th of July. Who do you think often lit those fireworks? Yep. Oftentimes, slaves are lighting off the fireworks so whites can enjoy the display. Can you see the hypocrisy of July 4th celebrations of independence, and there is slavery in America? It's a very powerful speech, and we're going to look at this, I believe, on Monday. David Walker, another free black leader in the abolitionist movement, he wrote this pamphlet, and I have a copy of it right here, An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Now, a big thing that marks a difference between David Walker and Frederick Douglass wants to work through the political system, right? He wants to try to get policy changed at a political level to eventually bring enfranchisement to African Americans, whereas David Walker begins to advocate violence, that there should be more slave rebellion and to fight for their freedom. There's a huge difference in that. And one of the things we're going to take note of over the course of our history, when the civil rights movement begins as well, there will always be two different ways of looking at it: the nonviolent approach and the violent approach. So here Frederick Douglass would represent more of a nonviolent political solutions. David Walker does advocate violence and revolution. Key concept 4.1, Roman numeral 3, letter B, is also about this abolitionist movement. And again, as I've been telling you, it's kind of strange how College Board sets up their concepts, but we got to deal with this. Here again, you see the abolitionists and anti-slavery movements gradually achieve emancipation. That means freedom in the North. Right? So eventually the Northwest Ordinance, if you remember that, 1787, there were some areas in the North that still were not applying it, but eventually freedom in the North does come, which led to this growth of a large free African American population. By the outset of the Civil War, over 500,000 free black men and women living in the North. Many of the state governments restricted African American rights, though. So here again is that enfranchisement. Even though they're free, they're still denied basic rights. And of course, any of it in the South is unsuccessful. But there's also, it says, anti-slave efforts in the South were largely limited to unsuccessful slave rebellions. We're going to talk about one here in just a moment. William Lloyd Garrison, we're going to talk more about him in class. He's a white abolitionist and perhaps the most famous of them all. He wrote a newspaper called The Liberator, and he was fought hard for what he called immediate emancipation. He didn't want any gradual freedom. He wanted slavery to end and freedom immediately for all blacks in bondage. And he will fight his whole life for that. Congress, this becomes obviously a very divided issue in Congress because you have many individuals of Congress that own slaves. Up until now, only 2 of our presidents did not own slaves, and that was the Adams family. John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams were the only 2 presidents to date to not own slaves. Andrew Jackson himself owned over 100 slaves. Since abolition is becoming such a powerful thing now in the North, in Congress they passed what was called the gag rule. restrict the use of the U.S. mail by abolitionists. It was passed in 1836 as an informal rule. HOR means House of Representatives. It was a rule in the House. Even in the House by 1844, you weren't allowed to discuss slavery there either. You weren't allowed to bring up the matter in the House of Representatives. But let's talk about this Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was a slave, and over a period of time, starting in 1821 through 1828, he's getting what he calls visions. He believes the Holy Spirit is sending him visions from God. He hears noises from heaven. He sees all these fantastic sights, and he believes that God is telling him it's time to have a rebellion. He begins to preach this to other slaves. And finally, by 1831, he's ready. There's an eclipse of the sun in February of 1831. He believes that is a sign from God. They're going to try to hold their rebellion, their insurrection on July 4th, but things get postponed. It's not until August 13th that he and his followers of originally just 6 men at 2 a.m. in the morning begin their killing spree. They first go to the farm of a Joseph Travis, and they massacre his entire family, including his servants. And then from that moment, they begin to travel. This is all in Virginia, through the countryside, massacring every white person that they can. Eventually, his force, his rebellion, will consist of more than 40 slaves. Eventually, they will be confronted by both a militia and by federal troops. There will be a small skirmish. Many of these slaves will run away. Some will be killed. Nat Turner himself will run and hide. He will not be found until October 30th when he's discovered hiding in a ditch. They decide to put him on trial, which I always found was kind of interesting, being that he's not enfranchised. But I guess for some reason they wanted to make this legal by their means, kind of strange, and they sentenced him to hang on November 11th. By the time his rebellion was finally stopped, 55 people had been killed. He had killed 55 white people, which included women and children, by the way. We're talking also women and children that he killed. This rebellion is obviously understandable why rebellion would happen. But we also have to sometimes understand then why white people became very afraid. And they began to pass more and more laws to stop the education of slaves. Nat Turner could read and write. That was something that began to really send a sense of fear into the South, and they began to pass more laws to stop educating slaves for fear of more rebellions. But in all honesty, slavery is what bred this. If white people had learned earlier on to end slavery at, let's say, the American Revolution, we never would have had a Nat Turner's rebellion. But that's me soapboxing. I'm going to move on to another thought. A huge part of the abolitionist movement is going to be women. As we talked about, this is during the Second Great Awakening era. This is the Second Great Awakening, and all these reform movements are coming out of it. Education reform, prison and asylum reform is happening. Temperance, the alcohol reform movement is happening. Abolition becomes the biggest part of it. But as always, in all these reform movements, women were the forefront of that. Now, women working hard to try and bring about an end of slavery and enfranchisement, citizenship, and the right to vote to free blacks. Well, they begin to realize, well, if we're doing that for black men, why not also for women, white and black as well? And so out of the abolitionist movement comes a suffrage movement. The suffrage movement is a direct correlation, a direct result. That's the word I want to say, a direct result of the abolitionist movement. And here's our concept. And look at that. I didn't write down what concept that is. I'm going to go get, oh, it's right behind me. Give me a second. You can hear me. It is key concept 4.1, Roman numeral 3, letter C. So again, that's 4.1, Roman numeral 3, letter C. A women's rights movement sought to create greater equality and opportunities for women, expressing its ideals at what is known as Seneca Falls Convention. Seneca Falls is a place, it's a town in upstate New York, and it's held in 1848. And here you have the famous Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. Now again, as I told you, here women were central to the abolitionist movement. They grow increasingly conscious then of their own situation. They're living in a world where the Republican motherhood has now morphed into this cult of domesticity, that women are only supposed to be home. They're only supposed to be raising children, taking care of a home. They're not supposed to be going to schools and getting an education. They're not supposed to be involved in the political realm. But yet they're doing all this reform movement. So you can see where they began to feel their lack of enfranchisement as well. They felt their traditional gender role was equal to domestic slavery, and they're quite right at this. I showed you the documentary, or some of you got to see the documentary on Andrew Jackson. It talked about women in this time period. The historian made the reference that men, husbands, literally owned their wives at this time period. So this is a type of domestic slavery. So working hard to bring about an end of slavery for Africans also led them to understand what about their own emancipation. And they began to create their programs for themselves, this what we call a suffrage movement, rights to vote, enfranchisement. And it also led to the idea of getting themselves some property rights as well. We might think earlier on in colonial times, in Virginia, there were some property rights. But that was only in Virginia, not as we became the United States, but eventually more and more property rights did come to women in this country. Of course, Seneca Falls is the famous moment. You've got several thousands of people come here. They're going to sign a petition. And the Declaration of Sentiments is basically the Declaration of Independence, but written with the pronouns of him and her in there now reflecting all men and women created equal. And a list of 27 grievances, but grievances not against the King of England, but grievances of women as to how they're treated in a man's society. It's a very powerful declaration. I'll show it to you. I know in your AP Lang classes, you'll also study it as well. So that's it for this YouTube video. We're going to talk more about some of this in class. Don't forget there is a video log already on Edmodo for this. All right, everybody, have a great weekend. Bye-bye for now.